So according to a recent poll we ran, apparently the American Civil War not only matters, but matters an awful lot more than the English Civil War. As a Brit, this interests me. Why do these civil wars fought so long ago still matter? And why is one still more divisive than the other, and reveals more passions and prejudices? Love to hear your comments down below. So let's start with the English Civil Wars, otherwise known as the British Civil Wars, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the Great Rebellion, the names go on. Fought in the 1640s and 50s in England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, its main point of conflict was the power of the king. How much authority could one man wield? Should the country be ruled by the one monarch with near dictatorial powers, or should he have limited powers and the country governed by Parliament? Other factors also contributed to the outbreak of hostilities. Charles's religious policies. Trying to align Scotland to the rules and regulations of the Church of England was a bad move on his part. As well as this, his and Archbishop Laud's religious policies were seen as introducing popery. Of course, the Irish Rebellion of 1641 fueled the fears of a Catholic resurgence and added more heat to the already spluttering embers. On top of this, the king's wife was Catholic, which in itself raised fears and the political temperature. The king raised unpopular taxes such as ship money, which badly affected too many of his subjects. As well as being hit in the purse, it also underlined the belief that Charles wanted to reign by arbitrary rule. And of course, Charles had an unfortunate tendency to select unpopular advisors, all of whom angered Parliament and the public alike. The Duke of Buckingham, his wife, and the fiery Earl of Strafford. So hated were these advisors that the First Civil War was often fought so as to rid the king of these hated and evil counsellors. The war itself was the bloodiest ever suffered by these islands. Per capita, more people died than in the First World War. It tore families apart. Brother fought brother, and father battled son. Towns were put to the sword. Genocide, starvation and massacre took place. It was a war that was fought for many reasons, and as always, there simmered a hatred for popery and the Irish. And to cap it all, after nearly 7 years of bloodshed, the king ended with his head on the block. The monarchy was abolished, the Church of England dismantled, and the House of Lords was dissolved. There is surely enough here for the people of Britain to not only remember the wars, but still be divided and heated about it. But are we? In fact, the English Civil War was a partial defeat for Parliament, in that, in 1660, only 11 years after Charles I was beheaded, the monarchy was restored, although with stricter limitations. The Church of England and the House of Lords were also brought back. So despite all this bloodshed, what had changed? Well, in essence, Britain had been changed from a kingdom into a parliamentary republic with a hereditary head of state. So essentially, the political and religious leadership had been altered, but little else. The Cromwellian land settlement in Ireland remained in place even after the Restoration, and the only revenge taken by the restored Stuart court was the execution or imprisonment of the surviving regicides. So in reality, are there reasons still to be embittered or heated by the English Civil Wars? For me, there are issues that will always reignite fires, especially the behaviour of Cromwell in Ireland, at Wexford and Drogheda. This in particular brings into play his deep-seated loathing of the Irish and Catholicism, and I would say not reflective of the majority of the English Civil War. The killing of the king will as well always bring arguments, though not heated, to the table. A duplicitous monarch who could not be trusted, who threw away numerous attempts to come to an agreement, and yet the order for his execution was signed by a select few and was not agreed by Scotland or Ireland or the majority of England. So despite these few areas of dispute, the English Civil Wars still matter, and they are seen as an amazing but bloody chapter in our story. They are full of colour, roundheads and cavaliers, huge personalities, famous battles. It is seen more often than not, though, through a romantic lens. So let us now see if it matches up to the American Civil War in producing heated debates and tensions. Just looking at a few comments on our American Civil War videos, and some Facebook posts in certain groups, it is not difficult to see that passions and prejudices still run hot and high. So what about the causes of the American Civil War? This will already cause some arguments, but it cannot be denied that slavery was at the very heart of the conflict. But just like the English Civil War, at its core, it was a conflict on who should govern who. Like the English Civil War, the American Civil War still suffers from debates on even the name of the conflict. Whereas the English Civil War has been termed the Great Rebellion, the American Civil War has been named the War of the Rebellion, the War of Southern Independence, and the War of Northern Aggression. The English Civil War was in the main a contest between two parties. The American, a contest between two parts of one country. Is the term Civil War appropriate in the case of America? Since this was not a struggle between two parties for the same land, like that between the Cavaliers and Roundheads in Britain, but between two communities territorially separate. Only in the border states, in which each of the two parties was struggling for ascendancy, could it be strictly called a civil war. And yet, does this wash? A war between men of the same race, who had lived for decades under the same government, regarded themselves as one nation, and spoke the same language, is essentially a civil war. Daniel Defoe wrote about a typical Cavalier during the English Civil Wars, who had served in the German Wars and returned to fight for the king at Edge Hill and Marston Moor. He found that the language was the thing which made him realise what civil war meant. To hear a man cry for quarter in English moved me to a compassion which I had never been used to. Another link between the two wars came from President Lincoln himself. When urged to offer terms to the South, he said that he could not treat with parties in arms against the government. The Confederate representative argued that it had often been done, especially by Charles I when at war with the British Parliament. The President avoided the trap. "I do not profess," he said, "to be posted in history. On all such matters I will turn you over to Seward. All I distinctly recollect about Charles I is that he lost his head in the end." On a different note, one struggle took place on a small island, the other over half a continent. On the continent, the question was what share of sovereignty rightly belonged to individual states, and how much to the federal government. On the island, the question was what share of sovereignty rightly belonged to the king, and what to Parliament. Or should the question be, which partner was the real sovereign? In England, Henry Ireton, one of Cromwell's compatriots, said, "The controversy was not what the nature of the supreme trust was, but whether the supreme trust was in king or Parliament." An observer of the English Civil War stated, "I do not think one man wise enough to govern us all," which would at the time have been abhorred by the whole nation. The question in dispute between the king's party and us was, as I apprehended, whether the king should govern as a god by his will, and the nation be governed by force like beasts, or whether the people should be governed by laws made by themselves, and live under a government derived from their own consent. In America, it was not a question between one man and a people, but whether the majority or the minority of the people should govern. "A constitutional majority is the only true sovereign of a free people," said Lincoln in his inaugural speech. It was necessary, he declared, to prove this once for all. "We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have a right to break it up whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapacity of the people to govern themselves. It was necessary to demonstrate to the world that those who can fairly carry an election can also suppress a rebellion, that ballots are the rightful and peaceful successor of bullets, and that when ballots have fairly and constitutionally decided, there can be no successful appeal back to bullets." Seen like this, the war was not a war for dominion, but one in defence of a people's government. A war undertaken in order that the government of the people, for the people, by the people, should not perish, and therefore essentially a people's contest. The war was seen in the north as being commenced by the South to destroy the Union. Cromwell wrote that it might have been a question of sovereignty that began the war, but it was in fact religion that made it what it was. Religion, said Cromwell in 1655, was not the thing that first contested for, but God brought it to that issue at last, and gave it unto us by way of redundancy, and at last it proved that which was the most dear to us. In the American Civil War, the question at issue was not religion, but the common rights of humanity. Slavery was directly and obviously the cause of the conflict. Our political problem now, wrote Lincoln, is can we as a nation continue together permanently, forever half slave and half free? The problem is too mighty for me. 3 years later, he had found the answer. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. And yet many viewed the evils of slavery as a form of religion. Many of those to whom human freedom was of paramount importance were willing to sacrifice the integrity of the nation for it. The integrity of the nation, which was already split by an invisible line, the Mason and Dixon line. The line drawn across the United States in order to limit the northern extension of slavery formed a rough boundary between Federal and Confederate states. Even in England, though very crude, lines had been drawn to demonstrate areas of support for the warring sides. However, Royalists could be found in East Anglia, and Parliamentarians could be found in Cornwall. It was not only geographical similarities that the two wars shared. Both federal government and the Parliamentarians began their wars with great advantages. Parliament, like the North, held the seat of the national government. Oxford, the seat of the royal government, situated almost on the frontier of the territory which the king held, holds a sort of parallel to Richmond. Year after year the forces of the Parliament marched against it and failed to take it, and its fall marked the end of the war. It is important to remember that Parliament, like the federal government, possessed far greater financial resources than its adversary. It held the richest part of the country. The taxes it levied were more productive, and could raise loans with greater ease. In the American Civil War, the possession of mines and foundries and factories was one of the elements in the superiority of the North. Parliament, like the federal government, also had the loyalty of the National Navy. It could intercept the supplies which the king sought to draw from the continent, and prevent him from obtaining foreign help. It could assault coastal towns held by the king, as for instance Portsmouth, or retain seaports besieged by his forces, such as Hull and Plymouth. The parliamentary fleet achieved no victory such as the capture of New Orleans, but its importance and role cannot be denied. And what about the largest personalities of the two wars? Can they have had a long-lasting effect on how we view these conflicts? Lincoln himself was assassinated just at the moment when his cause had triumphed. The captain fell, as the poet said, when the voyage was over and the ship was anchored safe and sound. It was as if Cromwell had fallen just after his victory at Worcester. If Cromwell had died then, his fame would have been purer than it is now. The next 7 years, however, would see his continual grasp for power gaining near dictatorial powers. So why does the American Civil War create more antagonism than the English Civil War? It is difficult, as in the English Civil War, the constitutions of the Church of England, House of Lords and House of Commons were all dissolved, and yet 11 years later, rebuilt. During the American Civil War, the Constitution was not destroyed. The Americans retained it, with a few adjustments. So why is there so much anger, bitterness and unwillingness to be reconciled? Do the two opposing sides disagree on the causes of the war? Does the South refuse to accept it was about slavery, and not the North attempting to stop them governing themselves? Is it through a romanticisation of the war and its leaders, cavalrymen like Forrest? Was it the ease of the peace? Did the South feel they hadn't actually been defeated? On this point, an American historian says, "Never before on the signal failure of so great an attempt at revolution, had a complete victory been attended with no prescriptions, no confiscation of land, no putting of men to death. In America, Davis and Lee and other leaders escaped scot-free. In England, the king, 4 noblemen, and a score of gentlemen suffered on the scaffold. This wise clemency of the Americans was partly due to the influence and example of Lincoln. There had been wild talk about inflicting exemplary punishment on the leaders of the rebellion. But one of the last things Lincoln did was to announce his resolution that this should not be. No one, he said, need expect he would take any part in hanging or killing these men, even the worst of them. Frighten them out of the country, open the gates, let down the bars, scare them out. When he was urged to take measures to intercept the flight of President Davis, he is said to have replied, "I do not see that we have any use for a white elephant." On the other hand, we find Cromwell in 1648 urging Parliament to take courage to do the work of the Lord, so that they that are implacable and will not leave troubling the land may speedily be cut off out of the land. We find him telling Fairfax that all his officers express a very great zeal to have impartial justice done upon offenders, and that he himself is persuaded that this is a thing which God puts into our hearts. In Britain, after surviving 3 bloody civil wars, the Rump Parliament decided to execute the king, that man of blood. It was a decision that was taken by a tiny minority, but it was a signal that the wars were over and that Parliament had won. And yet 11 years later, the institution of monarchy had been restored. This was eventually accepted by both parties as the way forward. And though a tragedy, the Civil War and its aftermath are no longer topics of anger and prejudice. In Ireland, however, it has created lasting and I think irredeemable damage. And as to the American Civil War, is it due to the South and the so-called lost cause? The Lost Cause is a retelling of the American Civil War that looks to highlight the war from the perspective of Confederates in the very best possible terms. Developed by white Southerners, many of them former Confederate generals, in a post-war climate of economic, racial and social uncertainty, the Lost Cause created and romanticized the Old South and the Confederate war effort, often distorting history in the process. For this reason, many historians have labelled the Lost Cause a myth or a legend. It is an important example of public memory, one in which nostalgia for the Confederate past is accompanied by a collective forgetting of the horrors of slavery, providing a sense of relief to white Southerners who feared being dishonoured by defeat. The Lost Cause was largely accepted in the years following the war by white Americans, who found it a useful tool in reconciling North and South. The Lost Cause includes the following 6 assertions. Secession, not slavery, caused the Civil War. African Americans were faithful slaves, loyal to their masters and the Confederate cause, and were unprepared for the responsibilities of freedom. The Confederacy was defeated militarily only because of the Union's overwhelming advantages in men and resources. Confederate soldiers were heroic and saintly. The most heroic and saintly of all Confederates, perhaps of all Americans, was Robert E. Lee. Southern women were loyal to the Confederate cause and sanctified by the sacrifice of their loved ones. Are these 6 issues still a cause for argument even today? Has a century and a half of romanticising the war and martyring Southern soldiers and slaveholders kept the fires burning between North and South? And is that the reason why the American Civil War is more of a source of conflict than the English Civil War even today? Let us know what you think, and remember, this is not a war. Let's keep it friendly. As always, thanks for watching.